Hi, my name is Tim Metcalf and this is my level design breakdown for Scorched Canyon. In this video, I'll be showing you my process, design goals, and challenges I faced on this project. This is a personal project mainly for my portfolio, but I managed to get a feedback and playtest session organised which was really valuable, which you'll find out more about later on in the video. My mission for this project was to try my hand at Arcane's style of level design. I watched this fantastic documentary by NoClip on Arcane Studios. One of the key things I found with their design philosophy was always having multiple ways of doing things. Here are some of the points that stuck out to me. The first one was, players have multiple options in exploration and combat so they can choose. They should feel like they are the author of their own story. The second one was, you don't want players to always be using the same tools. Frequently change the environment to shake up the players' gameplay habits. I am a follower of Richard Carrillo and his book, The Role of a Great Game Designer. The book mostly focuses on game design, but one of the lessons I learned was about creating design goals. So I figured this would also be useful to do in level design. My design goals are heavily based on the research I did into Arcane Studios. The first one is, allow the player to approach scenarios in different ways. This will change according to the player's own morals, so therefore there should always be non-lethal options for all confrontations. This really fits with Arcane style games, like in Dishonored, where you don't actually have to kill your assassination targets. There are always other options. This project aligned very well with a level design jam/challenge that Steve Lee was running around the same time. An earlier version of this project was submitted for that level design jam as non-lethal was one of the themes. But anyway, back to the goals. The second design goal is to ensure the player is aware that there are different options and ways to approach scenarios. Make it clear for new players to understand that this is not designed to be a 100% linear experience, but the player's choices change the outcome. If the player doesn't know I've designed alternate routes, there's not much point in designing them. The next stage in my process is to plan out the flow and pacing of the level. I find flowcharts to be the most intuitive way of doing this. This is my first flowchart. Here, I am focusing on the main core of the level. With the first version of the flowchart, I'm laying out the flow and pacing of the level in its simplest form. I plan to have 2 combat/stealth areas and 3 puzzles. Keeping with the Arcane design philosophy, all combat sections will have ways of getting around them that are non-lethal, keeping in line with my design goals as well. I will try to ensure that each one of these sections of the level can be completed in different ways and ensure the player knows this. With version 2 of my flowchart, I have developed each one of the core sections of the level. The main mission for the player is to rescue an ally from prison. One of the key things I've tried to do in this level is introduce gameplay mechanics using a pattern that I saw talked about in the Level Design Lobby podcast, hosted by a senior level designer named Max Pierce. This is an image of this gameplay mechanic pattern. You can introduce a simple mechanic like jumping, but before you get the player to jump again, you get them to do another 2 mechanics like crawling or climbing, and then give them that jumping requirement again. But this time you've changed it around, as you can see in the image. The second time, the player jumps from a higher height. I attempted to integrate this into my level with a few different mechanics. For example, in the first puzzle, the player will need to move crates to clear a path. This first puzzle introduces the mechanic of the movable crate. The second puzzle requires the player to move the crate and then climb on top of it. Climbing has been introduced earlier in this level, so in the second puzzle, I am reusing the crate, moving mechanic and climbing mechanic, but this time combining them. This enables me to add new and interesting gameplay to the level without adding any new mechanics, just combining and reusing the mechanics that I have already established. Now on to the theming of the level. I looked for references from the desert, mountains, bunkers and trenches. This is my mood board, a collection of artwork I'm going to use to help me design the level. This is not for the environment artist, this is just for me. 2D map designs. For this stage of the process, I will create top-down maps outlining the basic environment of each area of the level. I do top-down maps because it allows me to plan the environment before I'm in the engine. I usually find the more planning I do before I go into the whiteboxing stage, the higher quality and more detailed the levels become. Combat/stealth area 1. This is the top-down map design for the first combat and stealth area of the game. The player starts in the bottom left and is introduced to the crouch mechanic. Whilst crouching, they enter grass. They can see a guard walking past them and not seeing them. This should introduce them to the concept of being able to hide in grass. They'll then be introduced to climbing. Puzzle area 1. This is the first puzzle area in the game. It will involve moving the crates to fill up the holes, so that the player can then climb across. The overall idea of this area is to introduce to the player the boxes are movable. Ideally, I would like to introduce to the player the boxes are movable by having an enemy move one of the boxes. By doing this, the player will be able to see the boxes can be moved around. But due to time constraints, I don't have time to animate that kind of scene. I solved this by using a Boolean tool inside Unreal Engine to create an indentation on the floor. This gave a visual guide to the player that the boxes could be moved around in this area. This puzzle went through a number of iterations that you'll see further on down the line. This is the second combat and stealth area of the level. This area is only the outside and the second half the bunker. The standout element in this area is the watchtower. The player can either stealth their way through this section or eliminate the enemies. This is the underground bunker, which eventually became more of a temple environment. It is where the prisoner is being kept that you are tasked with rescuing. I would like to make this a bit more complex, as it is a real good opportunity to show off some arcane design philosophy. But this is just the base design. When I get to making this in the white box, I can add some more complexity. I would like to start with something basic though before the playtest, and then get some feedback. With this area, I have given the player 3 ways of getting to the jail cell. They could kill the enemy, or sneak past, or climb up over them. I will develop these ideas further with the white box stage. Now onto the whiteboxing / blockout stage. I used Unreal Engine 4 to create this level. I have a level design creation kit that allows me to use some basic AI, weapons and climbing system. To clarify, I did not create this toolkit. I created the level, not the programmed mechanics. The first area I whiteboxed was the initial combat and stealth area. Just playing through this section, the level does not feel like an arcane style level yet. I will not come back to this until after the playtest. This is my white box of the first puzzle the player must solve. Due to time constraints, this was unwillingly rushed together. This is the first time the player will be introduced to the pushable box. This puzzle will definitely be improved later on. I added a climbing puzzle section between the box puzzle and the next combat zone. This does go against what I planned on the flowchart, but I'm curious to see what the feedback will be after the playtest. This will serve as a bit of an experiment. This is the second combat stealth zone. I stuck to my top-down map accurately, except I did go off a little bit in a different direction with the tower. Instead of making a watchtower, I made a raised platform of the map where a guard would be on post. This is an image of the white box of the bunker. I made a dramatic change at this stage in the project. According to the flowchart, there would be another puzzle after this, but it didn't seem logical to me that the player would rescue the ally and then do another puzzle. Rescuing the ally seemed like the end of the level. So at this stage, I cut the second puzzle. To rescue your ally, who is the blue character, you need to move the box. This is the end of the level. This is a bit unintuitive. Even before the playtest, I could see there would be some problems here, but I can improve this after the playtest. Playtesting is an invaluable part of level design and game development as a whole. As you are designing levels, you can test stuff yourself, but there will always be problems that you will not be able to see. Getting other people's fresh opinions on the project is the best way of improving the quality of your work. Therefore, I organised a playtest of my level. I managed to get about 10 people to sit down and play the level. I then had them fill out a feedback questionnaire. The questionnaire was a great way of getting quantitative feedback. Alongside this, I went around the room and asked them questions about how they were finding the experience. This was a source of qualitative data. Quantitative data is stuff like percentages and numbers, whereas qualitative data is more about how people feel. Getting feedback through both these data types is a good idea when you're trying to see how people actually find the level. Now a short analysis. I asked a range of questions to the playtesters, but in the video I won't be going through all of them. You can see all of them in my documentation for this project. Here are the main points that repeatedly came up in the questionnaire. I also go through the solutions I implemented into the level. The first one. The box moving puzzle was too simplistic, and people struggled to know that they could push the boxes. My solution? Redesign the puzzle to be more challenging and add a simpler box puzzle to introduce the pushing mechanic before this puzzle. I had already planned this out earlier, but it seems more a rethink is needed. The second problem. The ending was not clear to the players. Design the ending to be more of a conclusion to the level. Change from a rescue mission to an assassination. This will require less technical requirements around how to actually rescue the character. And does the rescued ally actually escape with you, or do you just open the door? That doesn't seem like a very good ending. I don't have time to program a character path or an animation for the character to leave with you, so maybe change to an assassination mission. But going back to my design goals, I don't want the player to have to kill anyone. So let's make it so the player has to steal some documents, but a notable enemy protecting those documents. If the player wants to kill the enemy, they can. If they don't, they just need to steal the documents. That's the mission. This way I make the ending more clear to the players, whilst also continuing to achieve my design goals. The final major problem was combat areas are too easy. There are not enough potential routes for the player, and only 13% would describe the level as an immersive sim, which is typical to what a Arcane Studio game is described as. My solutions are: make the combat areas bigger, therefore having more enemies and being more challenging, and create more diverse routes for the players. Merge parkour and combat sections together, meaning I could add verticality to the level, which would mean players could climb up to an area and get a vantage point. Now on to my iteration. These are the changes I made to the level off the feedback from my playtest. I added a puzzle. This is a simple block pushing puzzle I inserted at the very beginning of the level. This puzzle only requires the player to push the boxes, not climb on top of them. My hope is that this will introduce the basic block move mechanic to the player. Therefore, I can then introduce the fact that you can climb on top of the box in the second puzzle. I significantly redesigned the first combat and stealth area. In the first section, where the player comes out of the tunnel, I elevated the ground so the player would get a clear view of what's ahead. I additionally added 2 optional routes for the player to take. With the added verticality the player initially gets, the player should have a better idea of the different routes they can go to. This way I'm meeting both of my design goals, ensuring there are other routes and also ensuring the player knows about them. I redesigned the initial box moving puzzle. The first section of the area introduces the player that they can climb up to the box. The next section of the puzzle requires the player to push the box through a maze. I additionally designed an area that the player can climb up and give them an overview of the maze. Players enjoyed the climbing section, so I decided to keep this in the level. I didn't change any geometry, but I changed the materials. This is because one of the players said they were disoriented during this section. I redesigned the second combat and stealth section of the level. I added further verticality and more enemies to increase the challenge. Additionally, I added some more areas of the level that could be accessed through climbing and jumping. Combining the climbing and the jumping adds a lot of variety to the gameplay and adds a bit more spice to the level. I dramatically changed the bunker and designed it more to be like a temple. I significantly increased the size of the area. I increased the number of enemies in order to increase the challenge, and I elevated the initial entrance so the player could get an overview of the enemy guards before they get into combat. I added more verticality and designed multiple routes for the player to take up the stairs. In the redesign for the ending, the notable character I named Sleeveless Jack. The player must sneak past Sleeveless Jack or kill him to get the documents. After my first iteration, I did a few more one-to-one play sessions where I closely watched the playthrough of the level. This gave me some insightful feedback. Players were mostly leaning into combat rather than stealth. This is not necessarily a bad thing. In the playtest, when I asked how would you describe your playthrough, the vast majority of testers said a bit of stealth and combat. So players like to do a bit of both, which is good, but I was still keen on adding additional stealth options for the player. Therefore, I created tunnels and vents that gave the player alternate entrances to enemy-filled locations. This can be found in each of the combat areas. Gabrielle Charoux, a senior game designer from Aurak Digital, was kind enough to give me some feedback on my level. The beginning of the level starts with a puzzle, which he said was too slow and is not a good way to begin the level as it's not very exciting. His suggestions would be to reposition some of the puzzles so it could be done faster, or maybe start with the combat section as it's more exciting. He said that the second puzzle slowed down the level's pacing far too much. The suggestions he gave were to shorten the puzzle, but maybe add some more puzzle elements later on. The jumping section, though players liked it in previous playtests, was also slowing down the level's pacing far too much. His suggestion was to remove it or change the position of where it was in the level. I spoke to him about my design goals and how I wanted the level to lean equally to combat and stealth. He pointed out how many of the combat and stealth sections leaned heavily in the combat direction, with lots of ammo pickups and cover. His suggestion was to communicate to the player the stealth routes more clearly and potentially add more stealth routes.
He highlighted how many of the enemy patrol paths were very complicated. I had initially made them complicated to make the environment feel more realistic, but he pointed out how making them complicated made it very hard for the player to read exactly where the enemy would go. His suggestion was to simplify the patrol routes to be very, very minimal, so the player could easily at a glance know where the enemy was going. My planned iteration based on Gabriel's feedback: swap section 1 and 2 around. This means the level will start with a combat and stealth section and then lead into a puzzle. Section 1 and 3 will also merge, resulting into one simplified puzzle introducing the mechanics I want in one go. If the puzzle is short and simple, it also means the pacing of the game will not slow down too much. Finally, section 4 will be significantly changed. The exterior will offer multiple entrances into the interior. There will be a combat route, stealth route, and a puzzle route. So that was what the plan was, and this is what I did. I redesigned the initial puzzle, getting rid of the puzzle elements and making it an extremely simplified introduction to the basic mechanics of movement, climbing and crouching. I also introduced the mission up to the player in a far more slower way than I'd originally done. Rather than lots of text on the screen at once, I made 3 areas where the text was introduced and various mechanics along with it. This meant that the player was introduced to the absolute basic mechanics and then went straight into a combat area. The next big thing I did is completely change up the second puzzle area, which was now the first puzzle area. I introduced the basic box moving mechanic and then the mechanic where the player could jump and climb on the box. These were originally spaced out between 2 puzzles, but now both mechanics were introduced in one puzzle. My changes to the final section were moving the house into the center of the combat area, added walls. This was to help show the player what areas they could confront the player and do a more combat-oriented approach, or go around and do a more stealth-oriented approach. It was to hopefully make it more obvious to the player what was what. But alongside this, I added more stealth options for the player. The player is now able to sneak around the house under some rocks and dodge past most of the enemies defending the wall. Or they can solve a simple box-moving puzzle and actually reach the house, where they will be able to go through the tunnels, which will give them a secret entrance into the area, avoiding most of the combat. I also made additional smaller changes to the level, which you can learn more about in my documentation. Thank you very much for watching my design overview video. If you found this interesting, why not give the level a play yourself on itch.io, linked in the description and on my website. I'd love to hear your feedback. Feel free to explore more into the project by reading my documentation, also linked on my website. All references for this project and the video will be found on my documentation. Now that about wraps it up. Thanks again for watching, and I hope you have a nice day.